In a significant move for regional security, about 100 U.S. military personnel have landed in northeast Nigeria. Government sources say the troops are on the ground, providing much-needed hands-on training, technical support and intelligence required in fighting armed groups. The deployment follows December 2025 airstrikes in which U.S. forces targeted jihadist groups. So this week on the program, we ask, what are the strategic objectives of U.S. boots on the ground in Nigeria? And what does it mean for the wider region? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. To help us unpack what this shift means for Nigeria and for the wider region, I'm now joined by our panel of experts. Joining us from Abuja, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, Senior Fellow, Center for Democracy and Development. From Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire via Zoom, David Otto-Endele, Director for the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. And joining us from California, also via Zoom, Dr. James Armstead, Retired Professor of Strategy, U.S. Naval War College. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us on this program. Let me start off with you, Dr. Armstead, and I want to get a perspective from all of you. The U.S. has announced that it will be sending 200 troops to Nigeria to provide assistance in training the country's military in the fight against jihadist groups. What exactly is the strategic objective of the U.S. intervention in Nigeria?
First, the overall strategic objective of the United States, which has been for many years to combat terrorism. Our war on terror has been worldwide. We have been consistent with this throughout the world. In Africa, we have not been as successful as we could be. We are starting to work through the African Command. We are starting to work with African nations. And I think this is a good sign that we are providing with Nigeria 200 trainers that Nigeria has requested. And we're looking at working closer and sharing with our allies and partners common plans to combat terrorism.
Professor Ibrahim, do you think the U.S. has been successful in the region?
Well, I've not seen evidence of that. The war against terrorism in the Sahel has been going on for a couple of decades. The United States has been engaged in that process. And each year, the level of terrorism has spread and increased. So we don't see signs of success in terms of their engagement, and there's no reason to think things will be different now.
Right, David, let me rope you in here. What's your perspective?
Well, I think you've got to look at it from the U.S. perspective, and then, of course, from Nigeria's. The United States, and again, I'm saying this on the basis that time is everything and everything is about timing. The United States did designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern, and did state clearly that Nigeria was looking the other way, while from the U.S. perspective, Christians genocide was going on. I mean, the Nigerian authorities denied this rhetoric, but the U.S. did carry out an Xmas Day, what he called a present to jihadists, and he struck at the heart of the Nigerian operational centers in Sokoto. When I say Nigerian operational centers, this is areas where they did believe that there were some jihadists, although there is no evidence on ground that strike did have any consequences. But the key for the United States is to preserve what it describes for the past more than 2 decades as being the champion of the war on terror. But for Nigeria, Nigeria wants to ensure that it keeps the relationship between itself and the United States. It does not want to be taken unaware. This is not just about the Trump administration. Successful U.S. governments, have, had a very good counterterrorism relationship with Nigeria. But the question is, why 200, men?
Right.
Does it require 200 men to carry out training, or is it some kind of half training, half boots on ground? Of course, this is something that the taste of it would have to be in the pudding, in eating it on ground.
Right.
But I think that, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to bring in Professor Ibrahim here. I mean, to answer that question, why exactly 200 men? I mean, Nigeria's defense headquarters here says that the U.S. personnel will be pretty much technical specialists and not combat troops. Tell us a little bit more about that, Professor Ibrahim. And also, is this a preserve of the U.S., though, to continue championing its war against terror? And is it justifiable?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't forget that the United States had over 1,000 military personnel in Niger, just north of Nigeria. And over the time U.S. troops were present in that country, terrorism continued to worsen, to spread, and to deepen. So the question of 200 is, for me, an interesting issue. Is the problem with the Nigerian military lack of training? The Nigerian military has had very high-level training over the decades. But the issue for us is, as Nigerians, is that we don't know the basis on which this agreement was reached with the United States. It hasn't been revealed to Nigerians. There is no evidence we have seen that this agreement that had been reached is in the interests of Nigeria. And that's why there has been a lot of concern in Nigeria about what this whole thing is about. It is required in our law that you can't have a military agreement with a foreign country without the approval of the National Assembly. We have investigated whether the National Assembly has given any approval, and it has not given any approval. There's therefore quite a sense in this country that there's no accountability in terms of what's going on this matter.
David, what exactly is the U.S. objective?
Well, I think the U.S. objective has always been to preserve, to always make sure that it gets itself involved in countering what it describes as global terrorism. But in this particular case, the U.S. has narrowed it down to ensuring that it wipes out, jihadists that it has accused of killing Christians. Remember, this is the U.S. rhetoric. Although the Nigerians are saying, no, it's not just Christians we're talking about here, we're talking about all Nigerians. Mm-hmm. So for the U.S., I think the question is, are we, going to be on the table and ensure that, Christians, in quotations, are not continuously killed by jihadist groups, or are we going to remain, or perhaps, watch the menu? So I think, for the U.S., they want to ensure that, they have eyes and ears everywhere. Mm-hmm. My colleague did state very clearly that the U.S. has lost its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities in Niger when it got, kicked out. It does want to have, its capabilities around the region. So Nigeria provides that capability for the U.S. So it's not just, in my opinion, it's not just about Nigeria itself, it's about the region.
So let me bring that back to Dr. Armstead here. I mean, in terms of the success of the U.S. troops in the region, the Sahel is presently classified as the hotbed of terrorism by the Global Terrorism Index. Can the U.S. succeed in stabilizing the Sahel in real terms and the Gulf of Guinea, Dr. Armstead?
Terrorism is a global problem. Africa is the second largest continent. There are terrorist activities in most places in Africa at some extent. If we look at the particular area on the border of Nigeria, where this problem is currently being focused on now, certainly the optics, that is the kidnapping of girls at Christian schools and the concentration on Christians, has brought this issue to the fore politically in the United States. But strategy is a long-term process. And where we're going with that process, I think, is looking at terrorist connections around the world. That's extremely important. And when we talk about something like numbers, remember, a training program has to have an assessment. We have to look at what's needed in various places. There are technical aspects, that is training on particular equipment, training leadership at all levels, non-commissioned officers, commissioned officers, my level, war college level, staff college level,
Right.
but also the tactical level. And having 200 people, that's not a very large mission in terms of training. You know, I've worked at 19 universities around the world, and the staffs to teach, to support the teaching, the technical support, all of those kinds of things come into play when you transfer essentially a school of anti-terrorism, and 200 is not a very large number.
David, your thoughts here?
Well, I think that it is not for the United States to, to determine, how the Nigerian, political sector deals with, communication or rhetorics. I think for the United States, they have an interest. If the United States' interest is in protecting Christians, it is up to the United States to determine how that format is presented. But it's up to Nigeria to accept whether to work with the United States based on the fact that it's a dangerous rhetoric. I would believe that it is down to the Nigerian authorities to come up with a counter narrative, regarding the fact that this is not, from their perspective, it's not a Christian genocide. I think this is the responsibility of Nigerian authorities to then, counter this, this rhetoric from the United States, but at the same time, benefit from using the United States as a support mechanism to fight against insurgency that has been bedeviling the country for years. So I don't think, we should, blame the U.S. for, for its own interest. I think what Nigeria should focus on is to see how it could benefit from its own, perspective. There is always a good and bad. So I think, what the most important question for Nigeria and for the region is how much are they going to benefit from this U.S. Support mechanism. It is down to the Nigerian authorities to come up with a strategy on how to benefit most.
Right.
It is not in the interest of the United States to see that Nigeria is stable more than it is in the interest of Nigeria to see itself in a stable condition.
So, David, I do want to go back to 1993. I mean, in terms of the success of these type of missions. Let's go back to the 1993 Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia involving U.S. troops and the more recent failures in Libya, the expulsion of U.S. troops from Niger. Clearly, Western military interventions in Africa have not all succeeded. Why does this administration believe it can succeed where other missions have failed?
The war on terror is not something that you can have a definitive time frame, and especially if you understand what I describe as the ecosystem of terrorism, which simply means that it does involve multiple national, regional, and international partners, and this is where, of course, the support from countries come in, i.e. the case of the United States supporting Nigeria. But of course, it's not just about that whole of society approach. It's also about an intelligence-led approach. If you understand that terrorism does place itself within 5 key areas. One of that is its level of motivation, where the drivers and enablers, where they come from, understanding the capabilities of the terrorist groups, which countries support them, how to recruit, understanding their targets, but more importantly, being able to identify the actors and then have a mastery of the environment, which is very key. And this is why the support and the buy-in of Nigeria and Nigerians is very critical. It cannot, if Nigeria and Nigerians do not buy in the U.S. Intervention, what I call military support, if they do not buy that in, then there is no way that President Trump's rhetoric of ending wars will be a successful one. And I think it would be wrong for anyone to think or for anyone to believe if the United States says that sending 200 men in Nigeria would resolve the insurgency crisis. That's not true, because Nigeria has a huge army that has been fighting this threat for a very long time. It has not been able to defeat it. Neither with the United States 200 men on ground, being on a support basis or whatever, will be able to finish the job. It does require a whole of society approach. And this is one of the challenges that most interventions, military in the region, including the Black Hole down in Somalia, have been able to prove that it is not just about deploying fire for success.
Right.
It is about an integration and a coordination of multi-level approaches.
Gentlemen, we are going to take a short break. When we return, we'll look at whether this deployment reflects a broader geopolitical recalibration in West Africa and what it means for regional institutions like ECOWAS and the African Union. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, David Oto-Endele, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, and Dr. James Armstead. Professor Ibrahim, U.S. stated policy under Trump was premised on a promise of ending forever wars and bringing troops home. How does this deploying U.S. troops to Nigeria align with Nigeria's stated policy on fighting terrorism?
Well, Nigeria has been confronting terrorism for the past 2 decades, and our concern has been there hasn't been sufficient focus and strategic thinking in the way in which the Nigerian government has been engaged in the fight against terrorism. And those of us who have been involved in this field have advised that government needs to change its approach. In so doing, help from outside is extremely useful, and we would be grateful for any such help that's made available. But you cannot have help that takes over. My colleague was saying that the mission of the Americans was based only on providing training. No, not at all. On Christmas Day, missiles were shot into Sokoto State. And after those missile attacks in various localities in Nigeria, there was an investigation by local reporters and social scientists. And it was found out that the key areas where the terrorists have been active were not at all affected by those missiles that were sent, which meant the America that's supposed to have all this information and intelligence about where they are, it turned out they were not really sure where they were and were just bombing places that appeared to be random. Therefore, the point I'm making is that, yes, collaboration is good, but it cannot be on the basis of sitting outside this country and simply pumping missiles into places where you do not even have sufficient information on what's going on.
So, Dr. Armstead, of course, there seems to be a wider, a broader Africa strategy here for Washington. What is that? And secondly, give us the feeling, your understanding on that promise of President Trump of ending forever wars and bringing troops home, and yet now taking boots to Nigeria.
In terms of the stopping forever wars, that was a campaign promise that Mr. Trump made. I would point out that when you are out of office and you are campaigning to get into office, you may promise some things, you may divine some particular strategic objectives that once you get in office, you can't effectuate clearly. Now, one of them is that the war on terror is continuous. This has been going on in a formal sense since 9/11, since 2001. But the war on terror has really been going on for over 40 years. It's been going on for quite some time, at least 4 decades around the world. Africa is a part of that, and it is a part that is interconnected. The training mission is something new. This is an agreement that Nigeria and the United States has come to aimed at a specific problem. We are trying to increase the training, preparedness, the readiness, and the capability to use technical equipment, particularly intelligence gathering assets, reconnaissance, surveillance, in the Nigerian army. We're trying to do that right now.
Right.
The missile firing was not part of this mission, but the current mission, attempting to improve the technical capability, should improve any sort of deep strike that's made into the future. And we should recognize that.
Right. So, Professor Ibrahim, you've heard all that. And do give us what you think here about the arrival of U.S. troops. Is that a sign of a successful partnership, or does it undermine African-led solutions and institutions like ECOWAS or the African Union?
Well, I think context is very important. Let's not forget what happened in 2012 when terrorism was really making rapid gains in Mali. And the approach of both the African Union and ECOWAS was to mobilize forces across West Africa to intervene to get put a stop to the spread of terrorist violence in Mali. The United States took a very strong position that the African armies should not be involved because, as they put it, they have a tendency of violating human rights. They therefore created a situation in which France had to be called upon by Mali to stop the march on Bamako by the terrorist forces. When that happened, the Malian government and the other governments in the Sahel were extremely pleased with what they had been assured of by the French and the Americans, that terrorism will be wiped out in a question of months. That was 2012. Where are we today in 2026? Terrorism has spread even wider, and it has spread deeper into our societies. And as this has been happening, the key question is, why is it that this idea of technical intervention by external forces is always seen as a solution? When we look back at our history, we don't have evidence that it's a solution, that they are going to do what these forces have failed to do, because if at the end of the day, the Sahelian countries had to force out France and the United States, is because of an objective assessment that the decades these countries have spent intervening on the war on terror has not met the objectives that had been laid out initially. Given this history, therefore, I'm one of those who doubt that just because the Americans say they are coming to help us solve the problem of terrorism, that's what's going to be the likely outcome.
Right.
Because I do know various attempts by the United States to solve issues of terrorism around the world has not created the solutions that have been promised.
Right.
Therefore, we should be extremely careful in considering the fact that, oh, it's just a technical support, they will improve the capacity of these forces to solve the problem. I don't see the historical evidence for that belief.
So I want to get your final comments, gentlemen. And let me start off with you, Dr. Armstead, as you give your final thoughts here. In terms of international partnerships and in reference to this particular situation, what will ultimately define what success looks like?
Success is a reduction immediately and the long-term and elimination of terrorism. Terrorism, as my colleague Dr. Ibrahim says, is a very complex, it's a socio-political, economic, religious factor. All of those components are part of terrorism, why we have it. And of course, all of that has to be dealt with, and it's very complex. We have to look at all of those areas. We have to have strategies that confront problems in all of those areas. Americans make the mistake sometimes of considering themselves the world policeman. We are not the world's policeman. We can't solve all problems everywhere. We can only work successfully with our allies and make joint plans, make joint strategies, and apply those assets we have that they want, that they desire, to work on plans themselves. The international strategy for terrorism is long-term. This is something that's going to be, it's like pollution in the environment. It is something we have to recognize that's endemic to our social, political, economic systems, and we're going to have to address that over the long term and work together very diligently to get it solved.
Right. Professor Ibrahim, as you make your winding out comments, what do you see as a solution to stabilize the region?
African countries have sovereignty, and they must take primary responsibility for resolving the problems of terrorism that have been affecting their countries. Having said that, the issue is, are partnerships useful? I think partnerships can be very useful, specifically on the terms set out by the constitutions of the African countries themselves, so that the basis on which that engagement happens is known and clear. And on that basis, look at the short, medium, and long-term strategy that would be effective in dealing with terrorism that has become such a problem in this country. It may take time, but I think what's important is really to show that there is determination in the fight against terrorism, and that successes begin to come out in a clear way. And it's on the basis of those successes accumulating that you can have a sustainable strategy for eliminating terrorism from our countries.
David, you have the final word very briefly.
I just think, when it comes to terrorism, it's an elephant. And, I don't think the United States has a big enough throat to swallow that elephant in the case of Nigeria. I think what has been clearly stated in the, in the background is a very clear mission objective in terms of what they intend to achieve. And that is not going to be anything close to swallowing the elephant. It's going to be along dealing with a specific battle. And that battle is nothing to do with winning the war on terror. It's to do with perhaps, augmenting the capabilities of Nigeria. And so I think, Nigerians should not be concerned about whether the president, did do the right thing in terms of procedures. I think what they should be concerned about is what role will the U.S. play in helping to reduce the presence of terrorism in Nigeria. I think that's where, a lot of us agree that, we want terrorism to be eliminated, not just in Nigeria, but in the entire Africa. Support is required, but how will that support manifest, in dealing with the threat?
Gentlemen, thank you all very much for that lively discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, David Otto-Endele, Director for the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, a Senior Fellow, Center for Democracy and Development, and Dr. James Amstead, Retired Professor of Strategy, U.S. Naval War College. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.